Hi, thanks so much for joining us. Julie Farrell with Directors Mortgage, and I'm here with Noah Blanton, President of WFG, expert on all things real estate, and also my friend.
Hello, friend.
Hi. Thanks so much for joining me here on Julie Does Loans, Between Two Loans. Today we're going to be talking about what everyone wants to talk about. Predictions on interest rates, home values, and what to expect over the next 12 to 24 months, as well as affordability and how that plays into things and where we're going. And you and I love talking about these three topics.
We do.
We do. And I think that there's lots of different lenses to look through. And so I'm just going to dive in with, where do you think we're at? And we practiced this just a little bit before we started shooting it.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. There's a lot to talk about. It's getting harder to talk about it. Things are changing fast.
They certainly are.
Not harder to talk about it, but certainly some elements get introduced that you don't anticipate, and so you adjust, your expectation for those elements. And if we backed up, let's say 6 to 9 months, we were having a conversation about some things that are different than we're having today. So, inflation is transitory. No one talks about that anymore because it's clearly not. But, there was sort of this thinking forming up around what things may look like. Mm-hmm. And some of that's turned out not to be true. We also didn't have, some significant geopolitical conflict 6 to 9 months ago that we have today. That is a factor. Certainly. And I think, when we talk about interest rates specifically, I think it is always important to just simplify them as much as possible because it gives us a way to understand them. And they're just a risk premium. And we've talked about that before, but all the factors that go into pricing that risk are the ones that we sort of talk about and we try to forecast and have conversations about. We can't, and you and I have talked about this before, we can't, not look at interest rates and say they've risen rapidly. They have. That's
Absolutely.
True. There's no question about that. But I also think, I don't know if, and we talked about this before, at the very beginning of the pandemic, they also rose very rapidly for a short period of time.
And we saw programs just
disappear
the landscape overnight.
And I don't know if we talk about that maybe enough in the context of the current environment because we had a market responding rapidly to new information at the time. Mm-hmm. We go back to the metaphor of just kind of them being a risk premium, and at that point I think we had some of the same factors we do today. There's unknown risk, so the pricing is sort of unstable. It's like we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. Same thing happened at the beginning of the pandemic. And I don't think you realize this, and we've talked about this, but I'm not sure that it's because it was brief that people realize how close we came to not having large parts of our mortgage market, at all. And why was that? Risk. The uncertainty, the unknown risk, and certainly interest rates don't like that. So cannot deny rates have gone up rapidly. Yes, that's true. They've gone above that on average 5% range, many in the 6% range. We certainly weren't forecasting that. And I will say cautiously that we've seen the rate of acceleration begin to come down, some stabilization. And the only comment I'll make is that there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, no question. We're not exactly sure what's going to happen with inflation. We're not sure how quickly we can get it down. We're not sure what's going to happen with some of the world events and how that's going to unfold, and we can't predict those things. But I would say that we are, one thing I do know for certain, we're in an environment where rates can come down based on their relationship to other rates in a historical long-term average. So we're in this environment where we're overpriced because there are unknowns. As our economy stabilizes, as other factors stabilize, I do think, we have the potential to have hit or are hitting peak rates in, let's say, the next 30 to 60 days. Now, a lot of factors that go into that pricing, but that's kind of where I feel like we're at. And without getting too techie or technical about it, I definitely think rates are above where they otherwise would be if we did not have some of the geopolitical instability and some of the unknowns in terms of what's the fallout to inflation going to be.
Agreed. And I also think it's interesting to note that while it's dampened the demand ever so slightly, it's not dampened it in the way that was, I think, expected. Right. And there is still a huge demand for purchasing a primary residence or even investment properties. Mm-hmm. But people are looking at financing them differently than they were 60, 90 days ago. And this is where I think working with someone that has experience and expertise and a large, robust portfolio of products that can work with the relationship and look at all of the different factors, you can put together conditions that are similar in payment. You can put together different ways to make the overall objective happen. But paying attention to the interest rate changes is important, but it's not the end-all be-all. There's different ways that you can create a package to get into that purchase money and have it be somewhat similar in cash to close as well as monthly payment.
Yeah, and we've gotten kind of lazy, right? Because we've had super low rates. Mm-hmm. So it's been easy to say we don't have to think about being a little bit creative, looking a little bit harder for alternatives, or yes, to your point, just working with someone who has a large portfolio of available options instead of the lazy part is just kind of, we haven't needed to go beyond a 30-year fixed rate that was coming in at 3%. Hey, what if that's available, use that.
Right.
But we have gotten a little bit, I think, because that was available, we haven't explored alternatives, and there are lots of them available.
There certainly are.
Yeah.
And in this high volume marketplace where you're competing against multiple buyers for the same property, there's strategies that you can put into place to be more successful. And one of those is to maybe harness equity from your departure residence if you're fortunate enough to have one of those. And if you do, then it can be a beautiful option for getting into that next home without making a contingent offer on selling your current residence, or maybe you're converting that into investment property and retaining it long term. There's all sorts of different ways that you need to look at your assets and how to harness this to create the best situation for you and your family.
And that I had written down something because I didn't want to forget it, and I'll forget it if I don't write it down.
Okay.
But I think the key there is rates in context to everything else. Rates aren't the only thing that are going up.
Exactly.
And the rates have a relationship to everything else going on in the economy, and we're I think well conditioned to respond to falling rates because we understand the upside to that, or we can understand it. But falling rates also were in context to everything else as well, and I guess I'll illustrate the point of, falling rates are good for one class of people, not another class of people, and it depends on how you react to them. It's great for a home buyer, not so great for a saver on a fixed income, right? Mm-hmm. And rising rates are the same way. I mean, maybe they aren't as attractive looking from the outside to a home buyer unless they explore some alternatives, but they're good for other classes of people. And so we tend to be very myopic and think about, only our context, which is, mortgages and homes and things of that nature. But I also think it's important to look at rising rates also as the positive effect that they can be, and that they're intended to be right now from policymakers, and the intent is to stabilize pricing.
It is.
And I think that's an important point that gets overlooked a little bit. We are, and I want to talk about demand in a second because I think that plugs into the mortgage rate discussion we're having. But they're intended to stabilize prices. I don't know that anybody wants to go through 2 more years of double-digit price increases and how sustainable that is.
Right, and we don't want all the properties to be owned by investors. We want more opportunities for primary residence home ownership. That in and of itself creates more stability.
Yeah.
And so I think that, to your point, it absolutely plays into demand.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to hear what else you have to say on this.
Well, I just, we talked about this before, and it's worth reiterating, but when you're talking about, the big question that I know a lot of buyers have certainly is, if I get into the market, is my house value going to go up or is it going to go down? And if I wait a little bit, will that be better? We were just chatting before this about some of the previous cycles and how they played out, and we were commenting on, we tend to interpret the future based on the past, and so we say, I know what happened in the past, so this is probably going to happen this time. And we cannot overlook, and this is a local market phenomenon, not a national phenomenon. So, there will be places where rate changes the environment in the marketplace more than other places. But from a local perspective, and we've kind of hammered home on this, we have a lot of people who need housing, and we have demographics that suggest that people are going to age into household formation, root setting. We're already several years into that demographic cycle. So the question, if I'm a home buyer and I'm saying, well, I'm going to wait a year or two because there will be fewer people that I'm going to have to compete with, or this market's going to price some people out, I think that's just probably not true. I think you may find yourself in 2 or 3 years with probably some pretty stiff competition and inventory that doesn't look like what we're historically used to. And I think we're in that cycle still. We have low inventory. We still have demand. The demographics would indicate that's going to continue for some time. And people still need a place to live. And so then it sort of becomes this it almost seems simplistic, but if you don't buy, you're going to rent. Fine. So let's start talking about rents and where they're going.
Right.
And whether or not that's going to be a less expensive alternative for you. And then it gets into longer term planning, right? Wealth building, wealth creation, and how you're sort of managing all of your assets and what that means. And so I don't think that we are going to see rental or multifamily become less expensive in this environment. We will likely see it increase and have already, in fact, in the last year, seen it increasing at a rate faster than purchase.
Right. Even
values.
with rates where they're at, oftentimes consumers are surprised to find that the housing expense payment for buying a home is not far off from what they're paying in rent.
Yeah.
And there's lots of different benefits to ownership. One, you're building wealth for yourself. That equity gain you're seeing year over year is all yours to keep. Secondly, you get tax deductibility more often than not. Always check with your tax preparer. I'm not an expert in this space, but home ownership has a lot of advantages.
Well, and let's be honest, in a state like Oregon that now has some regulatory factors that are probably going to mean that your rate on a rental moves up, that it has a floor. It's going to move up so much every year because of rent control. You're sort of guaranteed to have this increase, this annual increase, and you're going to sort of have this floor. Home ownership also fixed your cost, so that is also sort of a nice piece of that, is you get to fix your cost at whatever it is that you lock in at. So there are lots of benefits, and then when you're talking about an inflationary environment, you want to own real assets, and a home is a real asset. So I think there's lots of good reasons to say, if I'm in this market, if I need a home, if I'm at that point where my needs are now greater than whatever I have, move into the market. I don't think you're going to find an environment in 2 or 3 years where there's fewer people looking for homes and lots more homes available. And if we're talking about rising interest rate environment from a supply perspective also, let's say rates stay where they're at for the next 3 years, and they don't recede at all, and we'll just pretend that for a moment. We've disincentivized a lot of people who have very low mortgage rates to put their homes on the market and give that rate up. So, we always have to look at all of these factors that are influencing both supply and demand. And I think nationwide, and certainly locally, we expect there to be some diminished inventory if rates stay high, and I'm a seller that has a 3% rate or a 2.85% rate, and I don't want to give that up. And so I might fix my house or I might stay, but there is some disincentive working in the market as well that maybe won't bring as much inventory as we're accustomed to into the marketplace.
I would have ventured that those low interest rates would hold people into their homes longer than what they are. However, I'm seeing people, the drive to move is based off of location. It's based off of how the dwelling is going to work with their homeschooling, their work office. And so they're moving for location and property type, and they're moving away from those rates. And the rate is not nearly as important as it was a year ago, 2 years ago. And it's just an interesting nuance. I'm not saying that everyone is in that bucket.
Yeah.
It's just something that I've noticed from the slice of applicants and people that I speak with.
But what you are saying is that it has not been an absolute deterrent.
Exactly.
In maybe the way that people would expect. And so maybe there is some percent that is a deterrent that diminishes some inventory.
Here's what it
not
does,
everybody.
though, is it keeps them retaining the home. It doesn't stop them from buying the next,
Yeah.
but it makes for a delicious cash flow investment property at that low interest rate and raising rent environment.
Yeah.
So something to discuss.
Fair point. Well, you also mentioned that, I mean, if we're going to talk about demographics, and I mean, this is one that's been talked about for a while, but you had also said something about intergenerational living and, you know, how that also takes some of the bite out of move up or rate or other
Certainly.
things, and to your point, moving to a home that fits your needs.
Right, blending households and turning two $700,000 purchase money scenarios into the home that works for many generations.
Right.
Yeah, those applications are up over 30%, multi-generational apps. And something wild that I don't think many know about is on one conventional application, you can have up to four married couples. You can have 8 applicants on just one application.
I did not know that.
Learning. You can write that down.
I'm going to write that down.
Note to self.
Note to self. Find other people to buy homes with.
Perfect. But that also can help out with affordability, right? So maybe a parent has a tremendous amount of equity in their property, but they're on a fixed income and can't afford a whole lot. And kiddos don't have a whole lot of equity, but they've got strong income. That can allow for purchase opportunities that they may not see otherwise.
Yeah, and I think the take-home point there is demand is coming from a lot of places. You look at that demographic, which is a growing one here locally, but also nationally, where there are people that want intergenerational living or multi-family type situation living. Then you look at the household formation, and so what we're always looking for is there a basis for the expectation of diminished demand for housing? And that's the piece where I'm saying I don't see a diminished demand for housing based on our demographics, and then based on some of the changes that are occurring in places you don't think about, like what you just discussed, that scenario.
Well, and I appreciate your opinion, and there are lots of other very smart individuals that share that opinion as well. And the number that I'm hearing is we're about 10 years out before the demand matches the rate in which we can build, the production of building. And that's a long time.
Yeah,
so
it is.
We may not have that date exactly right, but that's a really long time to predict out. So I think the takeaway is we're not on the precipice of a housing bubble.
No, I mean, not. I'm always careful, because right now what you'll read and hear a lot about is a national market, and the national market has a role to play in things like GDP and some of the higher level numbers that you're looking at. So I always like to bring it back down to what's the balance of supply and demand locally. because oversupply in another market doesn't translate into ours at all. So no, I do not think that that there's any basis for looking at saying, oh, we are on the precipice of this large housing bubble.
I'm glad that you pointed out that we're talking locally versus nationally, because you're right. There are places that are going to see negative impacts on home values, and that's expected.
Yep.
But
I don't want to say that isn't going to happen or that isn't true, because it is. There are going to be some places that this has a greater impact.
Right.
When we're talking about, sort of the dynamic in our market for the basis for demand and then what kind of supply we have, there isn't a scenario that shapes up that says, oh, we have significantly overvalued or overpriced our real estate to the point where there's going to be some large devaluation event.
Right.
And, the other piece that we can look to for whether or not we are well outside of that is the cost of construction. And the cost of construction is also not going down. So if you start to look at your market and say, can I replace this home for less than it's selling? And if the answer is no, then we can't replace new ones for the cost of existing ones for the cost of new ones. And that sort of plays into, I think, how inflation influences the housing market more specifically. If the inputs to new construction are going up, and they are, raw materials have been and are, at elevated prices. Skilled labor is at elevated pricing. So we don't have a basis for expecting the inputs to new construction to get less expensive either, unless you were to have some large scale drop out of demand where the existing inventory would suddenly look like too much. And we don't have that.
We have less than a month's worth of inventory here locally.
Right. There isn't a basis for that.
No.
So that also sort of brings us back to the conversation of, well, what is a normal balance of inventory? Well, I suppose you could go backwards and say, it would be 2, 3, 4 months could be a normal range. Well, we're a long ways away from that. I mean, we would need a lot of inventory or significantly fewer interested buyers to get to 3 or 4 months of inventory. And not that we couldn't, but we're just a long ways away from that.
Right. And I'm going to segue into the next point that I wanted to hit on, and it falls under demand, and that's wages are higher than they've been for home buyers, I think, ever. The median income for the first-time home buyer is higher than it's ever been. They've been saving up. They watched what happened in 2008, and they are not interested in any of that. And so they've been hesitant to purchase. They've saved up. They've got good credit. They've got great income. And now they're out ready to purchase.
Yeah.
And they're in a great position to do so.
Yeah.
And so while interest rates and home values are climbing, people are scared of affordability issues. My applications are looking great.
Yeah.
The people that are applying, they've been waiting and being really smart about how they handle their credit. And anyway, I think that that's an interesting spot too. I hear people fearful of, oh gosh, who's going to be able to afford these homes? Well, a lot of people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that is an important point and we've talked about this before, I mean, affordability becomes the key, and that you can get quite a bit more nuanced with that. You can talk about affordability above and below the median price. It's certainly different in different price ranges. There's no question about that. But I think you and I talked about this a couple weeks ago about just the strength of applicants and that they can handle some of the changes in the environment, and that they're able still to move in. And that doesn't mean that everybody is.
Certainly no.
But it doesn't mean that everyone's also been priced out.
And then it takes me back to that first point that we were discussing. Maybe it's a rework. Maybe we look at the application and we change how we structure it up, and it's not the conventional loan that you applied for now. Maybe it looks a little different. Yeah. So.
And you have two options with rates, and I mean I know this oversimplifies things, but you have two options. One, the rate can continue going up, in which case things are not going to get more affordable, or it can go down. And at which case, if you own property, you can reorganize your financing at that point. And
Right.
so, I mean, I know it seems oversimplified, but if our expectation was that rates are going to continue to go up, there will be a point at which, you know, they devalue real estate from an affordability perspective. But let's pretend that they stayed elevated or went up. You're not really harmed by owning property because nothing has changed.
Well,
in
you've
that
got a
environment.
real asset.
You have a real
too.
asset, and if they go down, you can reorganize your
Mhm.
your financing. So it gets confusing, and it can be certainly scary when rates go up, and it does cause some confusion. I think you and I have talked a lot about this. The point of these types of conversations is to say there are alternatives. Look at the market in context, understand what is happening with supply and demand so that you can make a reasonable, informed decision about what's best for you where you're at.
Exactly. And everyone
that's the
is
key.
going to have a completely unique situation that talk to experts.
Yeah.
We are all here to be resources for you
Yeah.
and to give you information so that you can make good decisions.
Yeah.
There's just too much data.
Well, and to that point, you know, I like to say, especially in an environment like this, there is data behind everything we're talking about. Most of what we're talking about here today is there is opinion. I don't mean to say there isn't, because we're both very opinionated people, but there's data behind it. The demographic data is real.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the months of inventory type data is real. The construction inputs data is real. The number of people with low rates is real. All of these are data points that you aggregate up and make a decision about, you know, what you think is going on in the market and how it's going to behave.
Not feelings?
And not feelings. No. And, you know, I know that I think that's an important point, and it is why you talk to experts and you say, well, let me look at that data. Show me what you're talking about if you have that level of interest, so you can make an informed decision. I think that's important, and say, well, what's the basis for what you're saying?
Exactly.
Even, you know, my claim that I think rates are too high, there's a basis for why I'm saying that, and there's data behind it. And I can't tell you the exact timeline in which they'll normalize, but I think they're too high, and there's solid data behind that. It's not just a feeling. So, you know.
I agree with your opinion there.
You know.
I really do. I think that there's factors that are outside of the norm that we just can't predict on, geopolitical, as you put it.
Sure.
But there are some historical factors that we can look at and sort of see to the future and hold these historical truths to be true and move forward with that data.
Because it's all about decisioning. It's how do you make a decision in this environment? I mean, clearly the signals have changed in the last 6 months. You're not getting the same signals you were 6 months ago.
No.
So how do you decision in this environment? If you're looking at buying investment real estate, your first home, move up, the real question is, how do you decision? And I think that's what this whole conversation is about. And how do you move beyond, you know, sort of base level thinking that feels good. Prices are too high. They've gone up too fast. That feels good to say, and you can look at it and kind of, without a whole lot of data, convince yourself that that's true. And I'm not, you know, I'm not being, you know, silly about it. It's true. You could, but then you look at the data behind it, and you could also say, well, I can't get a 30-year fixed rate at, you know, 3.5% now, so there's no alternative. I guess that's the conversation, is around, you know, push in a little bit harder.
Right. What's the motivation?
Yeah. I
and
think
does
that's,
when you figure out what your own motivation is, then you can decide, are the current rates, are the current factors worth getting into, because I want whatever it is that
I want. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think that really is the key point, is it is easy to decision when factors seem to be, you know, when rates are going down. That it's not hard to decision there, except for if you look back at the last 12 to 18 months, it's been a highly, highly, highly competitive environment.
Ugh,
and
yes.
interest rates at 3.5% also mean you are competing with more people that can now move into a marketplace. And, so the question is, at 5%, are there fewer enough people that you still have equilibrium in your supply and demand? You're just not competing with 18 people for one home. You're competing with that home with 3 other individual offerers. And so I just think that type of context also is really important. And the question is not, is the market changed because of interest rates? Well, yeah, of course it is. It would be silly to say that it hasn't. But I think the expectation is that it has wholesale changed, that it's gone from here to here. And it's like, well, no, it might have gone from here to here. And those are 2 very different things. I think there's this tendency to think in either or. It's either good or bad.
Right.
And it's like, well, no.
Is it good for you needs
right.
to be the question.
Right, yeah. And I think, so that is the whole point of these conversations in my mind, is to talk about, there's a lot of underlying data that can help you decision. And, lots of people refer back to 2008 and say, oh, it is the same. And I have a lot of conversations, I'm sure you do, around that as well. That back to the earlier part of our conversation, we look ahead and we interpret the future based on the past. Many, many, many factors don't exist today that existed then. And I'll just say one, because I've said it before. 40% of all mortgages in 2008 were adjustable. 1% are today. That's just one factor. One factor. And you can interpret that however you want, and you and I have had some discussion on that.
I have opinions on this.
But it is still a factor.
Absolutely.
And it is a large one that is different today than we had in 2008.
Well, the performance on mortgages, I mean,
Also different.
I know that we touch on that regularly, but I think it's just worth pointing out that no one was rating mortgages back then the way that they are now. And without that rating system, we didn't know that people weren't making their payments. They would just refinance right on out of that foreclosure. And so how did you know that they weren't able to make payments?
Yeah.
So it's an entirely different mortgage world, and we do not have the portfolio of risk that we were carrying previously. So from that standpoint, we're not going to see the tsunami of fallout like we did in 2008.
Two data points, that we just brought out that are different from the last recession that centered around housing. And this just goes back again to the conversation around really getting good data to help you make decisions about the environment we're in today.
I love talking with you, Noah. You're such a plethora of great information. And, this people can look at interest rates and housing prices and say, oh my gosh, they're so high, I'm out. And I get that, I respect that. But I think if anyone can take anything away from this conversation, it's that you need to look at your own objectives and goals and see if the current environment matches up to you. Real estate should not be a short-term investment. It should be long-term. We need to talk about all of the different ways that this asset can potentially be acquired as well as retained. And then go make a decision.
Yeah. I couldn't agree more.